Hey everybody, once again, this is Mike Conforti, aka Manny Faces, the producer of Newsbeat, the podcast series that melds journalism, expert voices, progressive issues, music, and hip-hop. I'm joined by the editor-in-chief of Newsbeat, Chris Torowski, and the managing editor, Rashid Mian. And we're here with another episode of BackBeat to discuss the episode Hijacking Jihad, Reclaiming Islam's Personal Struggle. So yeah, what's up guys?
What's going on?
What's going on, man?
So, okay, this was our second, I guess, full-fledged episode. Recently hit the airwaves. You don't call them airwaves anymore, I guess.
Call them that.
Okay, well, then airwaves. Really happy with how this episode came out. It was a really interesting take on the word jihad, the meaning. I learned a lot from it. We had some great voices on this episode. Chris?
Yeah, so it's called Hijacking Jihad, and let's look at how this term, this religious term, this term that's existed for centuries has been repurposed and perverted by extremists and the mainstream media. And this whole episode basically stems from a conversation that Rashid had with one of the local Muslim leaders.
When back in my days when I was a reporter for the Long Island Press, I sat down for a conversation with Dr. Isma Chowdhury, who was set to become the first female president of the Islamic Center of Long Island, which is one of, if not the biggest mosque on Long Island, a region of 3 million people in New York. And while I was sitting down with her, she, toward the end, talked about her jihad. And I was sort of taken back a bit by it because you had never actually heard someone use that word in that context. Right. You know, because it's always whatever you hear on cable TV where extremists or journalists or a commentator talking about jihad and jihadists, and every time you hear that word, you sort of cringe, you get a tingle down your spine. So she started talking about that, but she started talking about it in a positive light and how it was sort of like her mission and her struggle to do good for the community because she was an interfaith leader. So once we came up with the idea of Newsbeat, I passed it around as a topic because it's something that I've always wanted to touch on, but I felt it may be a little controversial, especially because, like I said, you just don't hear the word in that context thrown around in a good light. So I thought it was an important issue to discuss. And then here came this episode, and we try to identify some of the foremost thought leaders in this area, in the New York area, who could talk about this, and we found some interesting guests. Chris, I don't know if you want to introduce the people that we spoke with.
Yeah, we spoke with Murtaza Hussain, national security reporter at The Intercept, Dr. Hussain Rashid, adjunct faculty member at Barnard College and founder of Islamicate, a consultancy that focuses on religious literacy, and Daisy Khan, founder and executive director of WISE, the Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality.
And the interesting thing about Daisy is that we didn't have time to get into it in the episode, but she was one of the key figures behind the Cordoba project, which became known, unfortunately, as the Ground Zero Mosque. It was a religious center, an interfaith religious center and a mosque that they were trying to build in Lower Manhattan, and it received a lot of scrutiny, probably unwarranted. It was simply just they were just trying to build a religious center, but obviously in the shadows of what used to be the World Trade Center, they never got a chance to build it. But she was called a stealth jihadist during the controversy. So as you could see, when people sort of use this word in a negative connotation to associate Muslims with extremists and conflate Islam and the word jihad with terror. And I guess if you haven't listened to the episode yet, you should know that the meaning of jihad, which these three guests that we had on the episode tell us, is sort of a personal struggle within oneself to be a better human being. It could be as simple as trying to give up smoking. It could be, trying to be a better neighbor or a friend. So I'm interested in talking to you guys about it. And, what did you think when you first heard of this new definition?
Yeah, this would be all new information to me. I didn't have any knowledge, I guess one way or the other than, like you said, what had been sort of delivered via media, that jihad, whether it was used as sort of an adjective, a jihad terrorist, jihadi, or that extremists and terrorists were committing a jihad, a thing. This you give the impression, exactly as it was explained in the episode. I think what a lot of people who are listening to it may also admit to themselves, I thought jihad was sort of this war against an enemy, this holy war.
Okay, you're calling for an American jihad. When you say jihad, what do you mean?
Well, I looked it up to make sure that I was being consistent with the spirit of the word, which is a struggle against non-believers.
So I was fascinated to hear the breakdowns. I was, of course, there during the interviews, and why I was so excited to put together this episode, because I think this is super important. Now, obviously, it is important to understand that there are radical extremists in the world that are doing terrible things, quote unquote, in the name of Islam, and they're using this term and they're saying this is a holy war, and they're kind of bastardizing it for their own agenda. And that's important because we want to, obviously, as a society, deal with these extremists and these terrorists.
Acknowledge it, don't hide from it.
100%. We recognize that it's there, and whether you want to, you have to go on a big campaign to say that you have to say the words radical Islamic terror. But that's the whole point, is that it's not exactly radical Islamist terrorism, because it's a perverted ideology that's not quite what Islam represents. As we heard in the episode by so many different people, including, not just Muslim activists, but both presidents, Bush and Obama.
Islam is peace.
Of course, recently we've heard inexcusable political rhetoric against Muslim Americans.
That's not what Islam is all about.
That has no place in our country.
That should not and that will not stand in America.
No surprise then that threats and harassment of Muslim Americans have surged.
Those who feel like they can intimidate our fellow citizens to take out their anger don't represent the best of America. They represent the worst of humankind.
But to understand the enemy, or to understand the extremists who are doing these things, you can't just use terminology. You have to understand the culture behind not only the extremists, but, as we heard also, in many cases, their victims.
One of the things we've seen in the modern period is a group like Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, has called Sunni Muslims and Shi'i Muslims and Sufi Muslims all unbelievers. Yazidis, Christians, and Jews all unbelievers.
So you have to understand, you have to know what these terms mean. It's basic, to me.
Right. And it's for someone like myself who had been reporting on Muslim Americans for maybe, half a dozen years.
Right.
I still didn't know about this until a couple years ago. And, when you listen to Murtaza Hussain of The Intercept, who does a great job overall of covering national security issues for that outlet, and Dr. Hussein Rashid, because they are the two that mostly talk about the religious aspect of this. Mm-hmm. And they both basically agree that jihad as it is known now has totally been redefined.
Right.
Because centuries ago, I think it was Murtaza he says terrorism is a modern phenomenon. He said centuries ago it was wars between empires or kingdoms.
There was no historical precedent for anything like this happening in Islamic history. Jihad, as existed, referred to a war between empires or nations which was declared by a ruler. There was nothing to do with indiscriminate violence by individuals or groups or cells. It was a form of intercommunal conflict such as you have had throughout human history.
And then it's Rashid who talks about how these words are scary to non-Arabic speaking people.
Non-English words are scary to the average listener. And so they use words like jihad, sharia, taqiyya, and so you get people then saying, well, these Muslims want to commit jihad.
So when you hear the word jihad, you sort of shudder. Or if you hear, someone, you always hear on the news that someone chanted Allah Akbar or something before an attack. And again, so it's these things that click in people's heads. So I think Rashid was sort of right when he's saying these non-English words are scary, because if you think about all the Muslim people who are traveling on planes who just start speaking Arabic to one another and are kicked off of planes.
Right.
So I think he touched on something that we all sort of seen, but we haven't, acknowledged or talked about very much.
Yeah, I mean, and also what the professor had said too, which I think is apparently true, it demonizes an entire religion. All the followers of Islam within 2 syllables are demonized as mass murderers and killers.
Right.
And, this was evident even just when Rashad and I were in the hallway, mapping out the episode and use the word jihad, and you'd see people turn around and flinch, know. And for me, this episode speaks to the heart of what we're trying to do with Newsbeat, which is rectify commonly held beliefs and narratives,
Right.
and educate about the truth. So jihad does not solely mean all-out holy war and
Right.
slaughter everyone.
Yeah, because it's it's interesting because the education aspect I think is important because there's been some efforts for some Muslims to try to reclaim the word jihad, but they haven't really had much success. There was one campaign I think it started in Chicago where they were encouraging people on social media to whatever they were doing, if it was community organizing or helping out people to put the hashtag #MyJihad. But again, like we all know when we're on social media, we're pretty much speaking into a vacuum most of the time, unless something goes incredibly viral.
Right.
So
or an echo chamber.
Yeah, an echo chamber. Yeah, so it's just bouncing off of one another, and the message is not getting out.
I would think that some people might feel awkward doing that because they know that the interpretation is going to be something else.
Right, that's a good point because remember we asked Dr. Hussein Rashid when we were in his office at Barnard College, do Muslims feel comfortable using that word? And he sort of laughed it off.
Right.
And he said, no, I mean, no, you don't. But he did
they should be
explain
able
that
to.
it's not. They should be able to, but it's not one of those commonly used words. That's another thing.
Right.
That before all these
it wasn't something that was being spoken on a daily basis anyway.
Right. They weren't even talking about it.
The word jihad is not part of a Muslim's everyday vocabulary. It's something that we are aware of, that we engage with.
But again, they're afraid to even say it. They can't go out in the middle of Fifth
Avenue
and
try to correct it. I'm reclaiming my jihad.
President Trump could shoot somebody and get away with it, like he said. But
you might not be able to get away with
go out there and say my jihad.
Yeah.
So I think that's the interesting thing. I mean, it's just like this term has been bastardized, perverted, and there's this negative connotation to such an extent that people are probably afraid of getting arrested just by saying a word, which, as Americans, we should all care about. It's not something that speaks to our values.
No, absolutely. That's why I say I think the education part is the most important part as well. I think with the difficulties that any group of people have with any other group of people, trying to understand their differences or their cultures or their terminology or their religion, being able to have empathy. For other people and what they're going through. And again, for a group of people who want to now maybe say, hey, this is a misrepresentation of who we are, and not be able to feel comfortable doing that in an open, free society, that's disappointing. So I hope that this does a little part to help correct that.
And by associating, fear and mass murder with this religious term, what that does is it fuels Islamophobia. It fuels these attacks against family members.
Yeah, it just adds fuel to that fire of being afraid of what you don't understand or what's being what's being presented to you in a certain way. We need better critical thinking, and you got to know these things. You got to be aware of them. I'm personally very thankful for this episode because this is something I didn't know or understand, and I know I want to have that kind of understanding about everyone and every group of people. So to me, it was very,
enlightening.
Enlightening is the word I'm looking for. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you guys would probably agree with this, but I think this is in large part a failure by the media to actually have this conversation. All the time that's spent, when you have a panel of 12 people splitting up the screen and they're all yelling and screaming about jihad and terror, but no one, how often do they actually have a religious scholar?
Right, someone who's versed in this.
To actually talk to people, well, let's talk about the word jihad. You don't get that a lot.
Yeah.
And that's largely the failure of the mainstream media. And another thing that wasn't included in the episode was something that Dr. Hussein Rashid said that sort of made sense when you think about it. He equated what ISIS is doing to some conservative outlets like Fox News because the way they talk about jihad in terms of extremism on ISIS hand, they're using it, they're weaponizing the word to try to get followers and to scare people. And if you have an outlet like Fox News is also using that term, again, they're weaponizing it to scare the average American, aka white people. To scare them from Muslims. So you have these two forces that
are supposedly against each other,
opposed,
using the exact same tactic.
Using the same tactic. So it's interesting. And
interesting.
It's the media's failure overall. After all these years, we're up to 16 years now since the September 11 attacks. And when you look at the polls, there's still so many Americans who don't even know a Muslim. So they don't even get to know a Muslim, so they can't learn these things, you know?
When you consider that Muslims are often discussed exclusively in national security terms, there's no wonder some Americans have a distorted impression of who Muslims really are.
And then if they can't learn personally from personal experiences, then how are they going to be able to educate themselves when the media isn't having honest conversations about topics like these?
100%. So that's why we're here. That's all they need is Newsbeat. Musically, this episode, obviously, we wanted to keep thematically as close as possible. We tried to keep it with the vibe. I think that we had this great undertone of sounds that worked really well in the intro, worked really well in a couple of places where we wanted to highlight what was being spoken about, and then got kind of funky when it needed to for Khayyam. And Khayyam was the featured guest rap artist for this episode. Special shout out to him, man. Came through with a really visual
imagery,
opening. Some really touched on, and it was great because didn't just amplify the messages that were being touted through the episode, but really put a spin on it to kind of give an idea of the perspective from the other side. In a way, and really give some kind of historical backdrop, some context to not just the word being misused, but why, as he said it, in the first verse. I don't want to say too much because I want you guys to listen to it, but if you heard it, you understand, why somebody might go this route and get sucked into this extremist lifestyle.
Decades of an agenda that invades and pillages. Civilian casualties outnumbered whole villages. Our corporate greed is the reason they bleed, but we still blame creed through a lens of privileges. We've created a monster for the sake of a sponsor. The vacuum's filled with these Muslim imposters. We rolled the dice for oil pipes and sacrificed our soldier's life. Our homies got a boy and wife who never share a joyful night. The other side, a mother cries. Last war, her husband died. She held a son as they looked into his bloody eyes. Now her son's grown after a life full of crisis. Thinks the only way out is to go and join ISIS.
Then to go in and say, and this is why this is so wrong, and this is why they don't represent Islam. So I thought the progression throughout his contribution was amazing. Previously, listeners have only heard from Silent Night, so they've gotten, obviously, and shouts to SK for his great contributions. This was done from a different perspective, a different, style, and, stylistically and substantively. I thought it was really great and a great mix, and really hit the nail on the head on that third verse and really put an exclamation point on this episode. That was super work.
Yeah, it was sort of like a story within the story.
Yeah.
I would think of it as, because like you mentioned, he rounded it out. He talked about the Islamophobia, and then he also talked about, the impact of war.
Right.
He talked about, I think he mentioned a mother not coming home, not seeing their husband again, something like that. So, he really rounded it out beautifully.
Yeah. So, shouts to Khayyam. Obviously, he's, you could actually hear him. I want to put this in the show notes, his contribution to The Intercept, where he goes in a little bit about his background and some of the things that he's had to face as a Libyan American, as a Muslim traveling abroad. He has some interesting stories to tell.
While flying.
Yeah. So we want to definitely point to his contribution on The Intercepted, the podcast that's done by our good friends at The Intercept. So shouts once again to Khayyam. Really great to have your voice on this, brother, and we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your contribution. That was dope. So I guess that's it. That's the that's the breakdown, the backbeat, the story behind the story for the Hijacking Jihad episode of Newsbeat. If you're getting this, you've probably subscribed and you've probably heard the episodes, but make sure your podcast app or your iTunes, your Google Play, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts, you have us on automatic, because we're going to be rolling out new episodes, new Backbeat episodes as well, and we want you guys to be the first to hear when we got something new. We got a few more great episodes in the works, and if you want to contact us or reach out or have any questions or suggestions for topics, you can do that at newsbeat@maurypublishing.com. Once again, thanks to Maury Publishing, MP Studios, and everyone here at Newsbeat for all the hard work and effort making these episodes possible. We'll be back next episode.
Keep listening.